Tonight, the president's pick to replace his fired attorney general is on the hot seat.
I don't believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt.
As Justice Department workers stay home or work without pay. And a freeze captures Washington on day 25 of the longest government shutdown.
I believe it's an emergency.
All that ahead of our CBN News interview with Florida Senator Marco Rubio. And welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder. We begin tonight with day one of the first big hearing in the Senate this year. The president's nominee to replace former Attorney General Jeff Sessions took a grilling from both sides of the aisle today. Here is Amber Strong.
His first time around, William Barr sailed through the nomination process as Attorney General. That was 27 years ago. Now, as President Trump's nominee, he's facing questions over past statements involving the Russia investigation.
On my watch, Bob will be allowed to finish his work.
Though not in the chair or the room, Robert Mueller took front and center during Tuesday's confirmation hearing.
I have the utmost respect for Bob and his distinguished record of public service.
Do you believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt against anybody?
I don't believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt.
Barr defended his friend of 30 years and promised not to undermine funding of the investigation. He also explained that memo to DOJ officials defending President Trump from accusations of obstruction.
I was speculating. I freely said at the beginning, I was writing in the dark, and we're all in the dark. Every lawyer, every talking head, everyone who thinks about or talks about it doesn't have the facts.
There were also questions over things like presidential pardon and the influence of the executive branch.
Do you believe a president could lawfully issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him?
No, that would be a crime.
Some on the GOP side wanted assurances a Barr DOJ would be different than past departments.
Do you understand that if you're confirmed, you have an obligation to ensure the Justice Department, and particularly the FBI is a problem, respond to congressional inquiries and to do it in a timely manner?
Absolutely, Senator.
Now, when it comes to questionable moments inside the DOJ, like those anti-Trump text messages between former agents Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, Barr promised to look into it. Amber Strong, CBN News, Washington.
Well, here to help us break down the hearing and give us his legal expertise is Andrew Cohen, author and professor of law at the University of Arizona. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What did you make of Bill Barr's performance today?
Well, I think there's a lot to like, and there are several reasons for some ongoing concern here. Barr's opening statement, which actually consisted of prepared remarks that were released to the press yesterday, offered a full-throated endorsement of the rule of law and its importance in American society, which is encouraging and reassuring. Barr also pledged to allow Special Counsel Robert Mueller to complete his work, which addressed a major point of concern for many observers in light of some of Barr's past criticisms of the Mueller investigation.
And Barr, he says he's friends with Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and he calls him Bob. Family friends, they go pretty far back. Is there a conflict of interest there, the way you see it?
I don't think that there is a serious conflict of interest there. My sense is that the two families are friendly and the two men are friendly. But a lot of people are friendly in Washington.
Democrats, they do think that he should recuse himself because of the Mueller memo. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, I think that is a real concern. So just to give your viewers some context here, back in July of 2017, William Barr drafted a 19-page memo arguing that the obstruction of justice theory, which he understood Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller to be pursuing, was unconstitutional and lacked any kind of legal foundation in the federal obstruction of justice statutes. Barr submitted this, as is widely known, has been widely reported, to the Department of Justice, which, of course, was his former employer. But according to media reports, he also shared that memo with the president's personal attorneys. And I do think that that raises some real questions about his ability to supervise this investigation impartially, particularly the obstruction of justice side of Mueller's investigation impartially, since, after all, he was, in some indirect sense at least, providing legal advice for the defense in this case.
All right, Andrew Cohen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, today, House and Senate Democrats turned down the president's offer for a working lunch at the White House. This as the partial government shutdown approaches 1 month with no end in sight. CBN White House correspondent Ben Kennedy joins us from the North Lawn with details on the latest victims of the shutdown. Ben?
Well, Jenna, today the Coast Guard joined the list of not getting paid. President Trump says they are working to find solutions and actually called out Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer and Speaker Nancy Pelosi for refusing to sit down and negotiate.
It's a shame that this is going on for so long.
The partial government shutdown now on day 25. President Trump remains defiant, demanding $5 billion for border security.
When it comes to keeping the American people safe, I will never, ever back down.
Yes, we do have a crisis at the border.
Some Democrats disagree and are digging in by refusing to fund Trump's wall, even to reopen the government.
This shutdown is eroding people's confidence in government. I ran on a platform that government works.
Today, the stalemate hit close to home for the U.S. Coast Guard. 53,000 Coast Guard men and women missed their first paycheck. A lack of pay has caused TSA agents to call in sick, which resulted in long lines at security checkpoints in major airports like Atlanta, D.C., Houston, and Miami.
There's chaos out here.
Now, today, Trump also held a call with state, local, and community leaders to talk about what he is calling a crisis at the border. Now, he's backed off from declaring a national emergency and appears to be holding out for a bipartisan deal to get the government back up and running. That's the latest from the North Lawn. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, the White House.
And for more on any signs of the thaw in the shutdown freeze here in Washington, we turn to Capitol Hill. Today, CBN News congressional correspondent Abigail Robertson caught up with Senator Marco Rubio. The Florida Republican gave us his thoughts on the shutdown, the president's authority to declare a national emergency, and new pro-life legislation he's set to introduce this week. And Abigail joins us now from Capitol Hill. Abigail, you spoke with Senator Rubio earlier today. How does he feel about the ongoing government shutdown?
That's right, Jenna. I spoke with Senator Rubio about this government shutdown, and unfortunately, he did not instill much hope that the end is anywhere in sight. Take a look.
Well, the only way you can end something like this is through a negotiation. A negotiation requires two sides to be talking, and it requires compromise. There's not much talking going on, and Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi's made clear that she's not willing to compromise. And I just don't understand, because for years we Republicans have been lectured about needing to compromise, but now that they're offering any compromise on the Democratic side, I don't see the commentators out there lecturing them. And I guess compromise means when 2 or 3 Republicans join Democrats, but not the other way around.
Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer echoed that same sentiment this afternoon, really saying that there's not really much of a compromise that's being floated, that both of them are willing to agree to reopen the government. They were both blaming the other side for this continued shutdown. And Senator Mitch McConnell said that if the government is not reopened next week, he will cancel the Senate's planned recess.
Abigail, what does Senator Rubio have to say about the president declaring a national emergency to fund the wall?
He says he agrees that there is a national emergency at the southern border, but he thinks that declaring the national emergency to get those border funds would set a dangerous precedent. So he does not want the president to do that. Here's what he had to say on that.
I believe it's an emergency. I would hope he would not do that, and the reason why is because I think it sets a very dangerous precedent. Future presidents could latch on to that and use it to declare their own emergencies for policy aims that we may not be in favor of. The highest standard we hold here is the Constitution, and under that Constitution, our system of government has checks and balances. That sort of executive use of power, I think, exceeds it potentially, and certainly in spirit, if not in law. And I hope he doesn't do it, despite me believing it's an emergency. I think the best way to solve this is for the elected representatives of this people to do what we're supposed to be doing in the federal government, and that is protecting our country by securing our borders and dealing with the humanitarian crisis, which is the biggest issue here. You have families, and a huge increase in families with children trying to unlawfully cross the U.S. border. They are overwhelming our border agents, and it's creating a humanitarian catastrophe. That has to be dealt with.
Senator Rubio also took a jab at the White House and leadership, saying that these funding negotiations should have been brought forth a long time ago, long before the shutdown deadline was approaching, to prevent the government from ever being shut down, and really to have given senators and lawmakers the time to find a compromise before these federal workers were forced to stay home and their paychecks were withheld.
Abigail, in your interview, you also asked Senator Rubio, I know, about pro-life legislation that he's introducing ahead of this week's March for Life. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this week we're seeing a lot of pro-life legislation being introduced in both the House and Senate. The bill that Senator Rubio put forth is really addressing the adults who are taking minors across state lines for the purposes of having an abortion, and these minors who are not their children, and they're taking them across state lines to make sure that the parents do not know that their children are getting abortions. So he's trying to make this illegal. So here's a little more about what he has to say about that.
One I'm sponsoring under my name is Sienna, which is a bill that basically makes it a crime to move a minor across state lines for purposes of abortion unless their parents have been notified. Many states have parental notification laws, and some states do not. And so someone will take a minor. It could be, by the way, in the case of an adult that impregnated a minor and wants to cover it up, they take the minor, drive them across state lines to a state without parental notification requirements, and they have the abortion there, and that would make it a federal crime.
Yeah. Do you think there's any hope you'll see any Democrat support for that?
No, you know, they're pretty locked in and radical on that position, despite they say they're pro-choice, but in this particular case, it goes beyond that. It is the ability of some people to evade state laws. By being able to cross state lines, but they're opposed to anything because they will only do, sadly, whatever Planned Parenthood tells them they're allowed to do.
And March for Life will take place this Friday. And interesting to note, there are 2 Democrats who will speak at it this year, Representative Dan Lipinski and a state legislator, as well as many Republicans who will also be speaking at the annual event. But the Democrats definitely stand out. You don't normally see Democrats at such a pro-life event.
All right, Abigail Robertson for us on the Hill. Thank you, Abigail. Well, in just a few days, tens of thousands of pro-life activists will begin a 1.5-mile march down the National Mall. We talk to the president of the March for Life when we come back. A census question is likely heading to the Supreme Court. A federal judge ruling today struck down the Trump administration push to include citizenship on the 2020 census. U.S. District Judge Jess Furman ruled that the decision of Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross to ask about citizenship on the next census broke the law. Furman said that, quote, even if it did not violate the Constitution itself, the decision was unlawful for a multitude of independent reasons, but must be set aside. Meantime, another federal judge ruling is forcing Christian organizations to fund abortion and birth control. The ruling is set to lift Trump administration protections that ensure broader religious exemptions to employers under the so-called Obamacare mandate found in the Affordable Care Act. Sunday's ruling will lift the religious exemptions in Washington, D.C. and 13 states. Judge Haywood Gilliam Jr. of the Northern District of California said the new rule was not in accordance with the Affordable Care Act. Well, many outlets are praising statistics showing abortions are down in America. Still, Profile supporters want people to know that 60 million unborn babies killed since 1973. The abortion holocaust is far from over. As Paul Strand reports, that's the backdrop for the 46th annual March for Life this Friday.
Here on the National Mall, tens of thousands of participants will begin their mile-and-a-half trek past the Capitol to the Supreme Court as part of the March for Life. This year, they see both victories and challenges for their cause.
It's a tough battle to win hearts and minds so that abortion becomes unthinkable in our culture.
March for Life President Jeannie Mancini says the new Democrat majority in the House of Representatives makes her job harder.
With the House leadership in terms of committees and what have you, that side of the Congress is the most pro-abortion Congress that we've ever had. So I think, sadly, we're going to have to fight to keep the status quo.
On the positive side, abortion clinics have dropped from their 1991 high of 2,176 to just 697 clinics now, an almost 80% decrease. And the yearly rate of the unborn killed in America has gone from more than 1 million in the late 1990s to less than 800,000 these last few years.
The number of abortions is down every year, which speaks volumes. The number of abortion clinics is down under 700 for the first time ever. I mean, since like a year or two after Roe. The number of pregnancy care centers is the highest that it's ever been.
As the nation honors the life of civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. this coming weekend, the point's being made how early abortion activists targeted the black population. Reverend Dean Nelson quotes Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger.
We don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population.
Sadly, that strategy has proven to be devastatingly effective.
African American make up 12 to 13% of the adult, of the women population in America. However, over 33% of abortions are performed on African American women.
And in a place like New York City?
There are more abortions on black children than black children being born alive.
Let's keep in mind that we've lost 60 million Americans to abortion. This is our 46th annual March for Life. You know, these bad laws are still on the books. And that almost every year, or that every year we lose almost 800,000 people to abortion.
So what can people do who want to battle for the unborn?
Pray. I mean, we're in a spiritual battle here. Vote. Vote pro-life. Your vote matters. Get out there. Come to the March for Life. Go to your local March for Life. You know, bear witness to the truth of life. And do things like host a baby shower for your local pregnancy care center.
As with each year, the march will end here at the Supreme Court, the same place the battle began in 1973. Participants vow to keep making the trek till the abortion fight is won. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from the Supreme Court and National Mall.
Well, 100 years ago today, 21 Americans were killed when something horrible happened in Boston. When we come back, Paul Strand gives us the story of the curious series of events that led to a disaster. On this day 100 years ago, something happened you probably haven't heard of. A disaster that can best be described as bizarre. Once again, here's Paul Strand.
Paul Revere made Boston's North End famous when he began his historic midnight ride from here in 1775. Over time, it became a melting pot of Italian-American culture. But history has mostly forgotten another extraordinary event that happened on these streets 100 years ago. January 15, 1919. A 50-foot tall tank collapses on the Boston waterfront, unleashing a massive tidal wave.
It absolutely picks up everything in its midst. A messenger with about a 4-ton truck is delivering produce, and it gets picked up and swept right into Boston Harbor.
21 people died as a result of the disaster, including 2 children. What takes this story from the tragic to the bizarre is the contents of the tank. 2.3 million gallons of molasses. As it turns out, molasses was originally a part of the economy the Bostonians would just as soon forget.
Boston and the Northeast were heavily involved in the slave trade, the so-called triangle trade.
Ships sailed from Boston to West Africa, exchanging rum for slaves. Next stop, the West Indies, where the slaves were traded for molasses, which was then distilled into rum back in Boston as part of a continuing cycle. Fast forward to 1914 and World War I, when demand for molasses reaches an all-time high. By then, companies were converting molasses into industrial alcohol, a key component in manufacturing weapons. As historian Stephen Puleo describes in his book Dark Tide, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, rushed to build a high-capacity tank in Boston's North End. In charge of the project, Treasurer Arthur P. Gell.
The problem is he has no architectural experience, no technical experience, is unable to read plans and blueprints, doesn't know anything about a factor of safety, and barely asks anything about any of these things.
By the time Gel locks in a location, he has only 2 months before the first large shipment of molasses is due to arrive. In the rush to finish the project, quality suffers.
The tank begins to leak almost from the beginning. So much so that children from the North End would go down to the site and scoop up molasses with their pails and bring them home. At one point, Arthur P. Gel has the tank painted the color of molasses to disguise those leaks.
After the war ends in November 1918, as the likelihood of prohibition approaches, the company switches gears to produce as much rum as possible before the 18th Amendment goes into effect. 3 months later, January 15, 1919, shortly after noon, a Boston police officer makes a routine call to headquarters.
When he hears what he describes as this tremendous rumbling, grinding sound and the rat-tat-tat of what he feels is like machine gun bullets, he turns around and he sees this tank disintegrating before his eyes, the rat-tat-tat of the rivets, thousands of rivets in the tank pulling away.
The 160-foot wide wave of molasses travels at a speed of 35 miles per hour, leveling off to a height of 25 feet. It crushes everything in its path, tearing this firehouse from its foundation, completely collapsing the first floor. The waterfront is unrecognizable.
A criminal inquest finds USIA responsible for the catastrophe, but a grand jury files no charges. The only hope for justice for the victims is a civil suit.
It really is a David versus Goliath kind of situation. United States Industrial Alcohol is a large industrial corporation. Up against them are these 119 plaintiffs who are almost exclusively Irish city workers who worked for the city of Boston or Italian immigrants who worked in and around the docks.
The Massachusetts Superior Court assigns one of Boston's most well-known lawyers to oversee the case, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Ogden. The son of an Episcopalian minister, Ogden left a lucrative law practice at age 45 to enlist in the Army. The war profoundly changed Ogden, who would later write of his fellow soldiers, "They did not give their lives so the great might have further privilege to oppress the small." The hearings take 3 long years, in part because Ogden insists each victim be heard. In a decision that changes the course of history, he finds United States Industrial Alcohol liable.
Almost everything we take for granted today in the building construction industry, that architects need to show their work, engineers need to sign and seal their plans, building inspectors need to come out and check projects. Almost every single one of those comes about as a direct result of the Great Boston Molasses Flood case.
It has been said that God uses ordinary people to carry out his extraordinary plans. Such is the case with Hugh Ogden. Although his name has been lost to history, his legacy is undeniable. Paul Strand, CBN News.
Yeah, extraordinary indeed. Well, that is going to do it for Faith Nation. Thanks for joining us and have a great evening.